All right, Tim, take it over.
Okay, so we're continuing for How God Makes Men, 10 epic stories, 10 proven principles, 10 men from Scripture. Last week we got into Abraham. So we learned a little about how God makes men by showing us how we can believe him anyway in the face of what seemed like impossible circumstances. Talked about Bible time, history, him leaving the country, and his wife were promised a baby and waiting years and years, and they sacrificed, and then it comes to Isaac, and then he's still waiting, and then he realizes how God planned his life. So in last week, and just so you know, every chapter, every section of men that we cover through this book has a principle. And last week, the principle was believing God anyway, how God makes a man's faith stronger. So God makes men by showing us how we can believe him anyway in the face of what seems like impossible circumstances. So that is our principle, and we'll have one for Joseph, which we'll be covering tonight. So Joseph and the greater good. Before we go any further, it is now more apparent to me and Todd that everyone really needs to get this book. This book covers so much more than we try to cover within the short period of time that we have with you. We have notes and notes and notes of the great stuff that Morley has, and Joseph is no exception to that rule. So we're going to get into Joseph. Right now, we're going to show you just a little about his life, just in a little animation, and then we're going to get a little more deeper into Joseph and what Morley has to say about him and the lesson and the principle for him as well. So let's see this video.
The Faithful Hall of Fame, Joseph. This is Joseph, who was the son of Israel and Rachel. But he had 11 brothers who hated him and sold him into slavery. After being put in jail, Joseph told of the future of Egypt when he interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, and Joseph found favor with the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh made Joseph a leader in his kingdom. Just as Joseph had told the Pharaoh, Egypt had 7 years of abundance. Then the 7 years of abundance came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. But the Egyptians had food to eat because Joseph had planned for the famine. There was famine in all the other lands, and many came to Joseph to buy food. There was even a famine in the land that Joseph came from. So when Israel heard that there was grain in Egypt, he sent his sons to buy some. But Israel did not send Benjamin with the others because he was afraid that harm might come to him. When Joseph's brothers came to him, Joseph recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger. So Joseph decided to test his brothers. He had his interpreter tell them to send for Benjamin, who had stayed home. And then he threw his brothers in jail for 3 days. On the 3rd day, Joseph let all but one of the brothers take grain to their starving households with the instruction to bring Benjamin back. But Joseph provided for his brothers' journey and gave them grain and silver. The brothers did exactly as Joseph instructed, as they were scared that God was punishing them for what they had done to Joseph so many years before. They traveled home to their father's house, then back to Egypt. Now that he had seen that they brought Benjamin, Joseph was overwhelmed, so he released the brother who was still in prison. But Joseph decided to play one more trick on his brothers. He sent the brothers away but told his servant to hide his silver cup in Benjamin's bag. Then Joseph told the servant to go after the brothers and retrieve the cup. The brothers hadn't traveled far before the servant stopped them and accused them of stealing the cup. Joseph could no longer control himself before his attendants. He made them leave so he could be alone with his brothers, and he told his brothers who he really was. Ta-da! He told them of his life and all he had experienced, and he forgave them for what they had done. God was with Joseph and took care of him and showed him favor.
Okay, Tim, you up?
Here I am. Okay, another thing about, we know just a little about Joseph from what we see here, but what we also want to keep in mind as we go further, it seems evident, like when they did Abraham, we had to know, he took for granted that we knew who God's voice, what he sounded like and how he communicates with us. And in this case, is another important thing is the impossibility. God can do impossible things like a flattened squirrel in the roadway and bring it to life, a failed, miserable, irreconcilable marriage, things that were really impossible, nature impossible. If we don't believe that, we might as well not go any further, because we are making God limited. And there are times that we go through our life that we think that we know all the answers, and we replace God with what we know, which there's no way we can match that to what God does in our life and how we can figure out why he's doing a certain thing.
That's right.
So in this question, is there anything God cannot do? Can he really do all the things that it says in scripture, or the things in our life that he can really repair the things that he wants to repair? So that thing really comes to the point of, do we really believe that? And
Yeah.
Morley, throughout his book, he has great references to giving that all to God and how we can build in the faith. It's not an automatic thing. It's a step-by-step thing that we learn more. Just like in Joseph's life, what we saw a short little snippet of that is that it was in sections of his life of how he built his faith and how he believed God can do the impossible. And he had things organized for his life, even though those things at the time seemed really terrible.
Okay.
So,
Yep.
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, now I'm remembering to just add something to that. So this next video that we're going to be watching is kind of a little segue, but you may have some people that kind of knock on the Christian faith and say, your God can't do everything. There are things that he can't do. And that's, and we believe that he can. We base that on the Bible, but if they don't take the Bible to be true, or one of the questions that a lot of times even atheists or other people will bring up is, they'll think up stupid questions like, so are you saying that your God could make a rock so big that he can't pick it up? Philosophical questions like that. And so we wanted to take a little sidebar here with this short video that helps you to respond when you share your faith with others, that if someone were to say, you say your God can do everything, but can he do this? And here's how you answer that.
Can God make a rock so big that he can't lift it? Or as Bart Simpson would say, can God make a burrito so big that he can't eat it? Now, why does this seem like a significant challenge? Well, if you say yes, God can do it, then God is limited because he makes a rock so big and now there's something he can't do. If you say no, God can't do it, then God is also limited. So as the skeptic would say, either way, we find that there's something God cannot do. And at first, Christians often get flustered by this, but I say, let's ask a more basic question. Can God do anything? And usually when I ask audiences, especially young people, can God do anything? Every hand shoots up because we want to say, no, you can't limit God. And then I'll bring a volunteer up and I'll say, all right, I've got a task for you. And I'll take a paper clip. And what I'll do this paper clip is I'll say, all right, can you bend this into a square circle. Now, half the time, the student will actually try to do it and then give up pretty quickly. The other half the time, they won't even take it from me, realizing that such a thing can't be done. I'll say, all right, what if we had Arnold Schwarzenegger or Samson here, one of the strongest people on the planet? Could they turn a paperclip into a square circle? And the answer is no. Why? Because it doesn't matter how much power you have, a square circle cannot exist. So even God couldn't make a square circle. This is not a limitation upon God. This is a limitation on the nature of a square circle, which in itself cannot exist. So when we say God can do anything, we mean God can do anything that can be done. But then there's another follow-up question. Could God tell a lie? Could God deceive you? Could God cause himself to cease to exist? And the answer is no. In fact, I said to a student one time, I said, you know, God can't tell a lie, but you can. Yes, you can tell a lie. God can't. That's not a strength. That's a weakness. God can't tell a lie because God is perfect. It's like saying, can God need glasses to see? And if you need glasses, that's a recognition of a weakness. Because God is perfect, he has no weaknesses. So when we say God is all-powerful, what we mean is God can do anything that's logically possible that power can do, that's consistent with his nature. So can God make a rock so big he can't lift it? The answer is no. That's not a recognition of a weakness in God. That's a recognition that that very idea is absurd within itself. If something can be done and it's morally good, God can do it. This tells us that the Christian God is trustworthy. That means that God will not lie. He will not deceive us. Even though people around us will, and we ourselves at times have done things we know is wrong, God is the only one who is always good and uses his power for that end. That's a God worth trusting.
So again, the reason why that we showed that is because it is true, like Tim said, you know, with the story of Abraham, you know, you have to believe that God speaks, or else the story of Abraham doesn't make sense, or to believe in a God that's trustworthy. And with the story of Joseph, you have to believe that God can do the impossible, and that's just a core belief, and that is something that we're going to talk about with the story of Joseph. That he had to believe as well.
So the Joseph and the greater good. So each segment of his life, he had to realize that maybe there was something greater than what he was experiencing. Right from the beginning, Joseph really had it good, right? Because he was the chosen one by his son, Jacob. He had the coat, but his brothers hated him. I mean, hated him. And they hated him so much that they decide to strip him of that coat and throw him in a pit. And then not only that, that then he was going to be sold as a slave. So the abandonment is what you see here on the screen. Have you ever felt abandoned? Not just in a biblical term from God, but in just anything. Have you ever been abandoned to the point where you felt you were all alone? He wasn't around there. And don't we think that Joseph, as a young boy, was thinking about those same things? Then once he went through his life of that abandonment, still was God with him? Did he ever feel abandoned? He was abandoned by his brothers, abandoned by his family, he seemed like. So he was going on through his life. Morley really puts into focus a bigger picture issue, the possibility of how God can put all this together, and then our own feelings of abandonment. How is that possible? That we can stay focused on trusting God, that he can do impossible things in our life, every segment. But we get caught up, especially as men, we live in the moment of impossibilities, and not that this bad thing that happened was necessary. And this is what Morley says throughout the book with Joseph. Yes, this might see a sidestep to what God has planned for him. Maybe he was a chosen one, or he had, his father's privilege of being spoiled, but yet he had the hatred from his own brothers. So then we get to Egypt. He even goes to prison.
Here, real quick, Tim.
Sure.
Because when we showed that video earlier of the cartoon, and we showed, and it kind of looked like, that his brothers hated him. But we have a video clip, actually, of what it looks like in real life, what actually happened to him. And it's a lot more traumatic experience than probably just the cartoon showed. So let's show this real quick.
Okay.
This is the only chance you'll ever have to be done with him. That's right. To assume our rightful place once the old man's gone. Let's do it. Let's your minds. You can't spill a brother's blood. Have you thought of the curse which will fall upon us if we do this? Stop it! Stop it now before it's too late!
Stop what?
Ignore him. Don't speak to boys who come to work in groom's clothing.
They come in search of more tales to tell.
Father wants a report, and he thinks I'm the one to do the job. He told me...
Forget what he told you. You report on me, and it'll be the last thing you do. Simeon!
I'll do as Father instructed.
Simeon, stop it!
I'll do as Father tells me. And your warning smells of too much water.
Hold him back! Stop
So pretty traumatic. And Tim, you had mentioned, and you can continue, that that wasn't the first trauma that was to happen in his life. That just kind of started a downward spiral for him.
Mm-hmm. And in Morley's book, he has a great quote: "Nothing is more painful than feeling you've been abandoned by God." So did Joseph at this young age feel that he was beginning to be abandoned by God? And have we gone through that too? Like we mentioned earlier in that question about have you been abandoned? Have you been abandoned, or how did you feel when you were abandoned, or have you ever been abandoned? And that is that short snippet of his life, and Joseph's life was what Morley is going through through this whole thing.
Yeah, and
so,
it even this was like the beginning, because then that the story goes that a bunch of merchants came by, and his brothers actually sold him to just strangers to take him to a foreign land. So it's bad enough they threw him into the well, and traumatic experience of all your brothers ganging up on you. You don't know if they're going to kill you or what, and probably some of them wanted to. But then they actually sold him, took his coat, put some blood of an animal on it, and told his dad that he had been attacked by an animal and that he was dead. So as far as his dad was concerned, Joseph was dead. And so talk about total abandonment. And then once he gets to Egypt, he's thrown into prison. And you got to believe that, not only abandoned by his family, but that, like Tim was saying, an abandonment by God to go, up to this point, before all this happened, Joseph was a faithful boy and honored his dad, honored God. And sitting in prison now where we find him, he's got to be wondering, like, God can't be in on this. What did I do to invoke the wrath of God? This can't be something that God knows going on, or what? Just a huge feeling of desperation and fear and true abandonment.
and Morley gives another, in following up with this question: do you trust the will of God? Morley has in his book as well: do you really believe that God is faithfully at work in your life today, leading you, shaping you, and remaking you into a more complete man for his glory? And goes into that God does have good news for us, because we're learning this from Joseph. So do we really trust him then? So if he can do impossible things, and can we really trust him to guide our life, and for us to take that chance of following him? Todd, are we going to show these two videos of the trust element of God here?
Yeah, because that's the question that I have for you fellas that we wrestled with when we were doing this study, is that, if you were sitting in that jail cell and what had just happened to Joseph, would you be sitting there going, God can't be involved in this? Or would you have the kind of faith and trust to say God still may be a part of this and orchestrating a bigger plan that's going on? And so do we trust the will of God, ultimately, that God's in control and that nothing happens without him knowing, and that he will work things for good? And here's just a couple kind of cartoon examples to show you really quick of what it's like when sometimes we just look at what's around us in the short term. We don't see the bigger picture.
This is a great example, and Morley puts this as Joseph. That's why I use this biblical story of Joseph. He says it beautifully illustrates how this principle works, this principle of faith and trust and impossibility of what God can do. So he says in this chapter, learn the remarkable truth that empowered Joseph to get on top of his feelings of abandonment to finish strong. It gave purpose and meaning to every moment of the entire 22 years that he had spent in exile and suffering. So, and again, this isn't the best part of the story. We may think we know this, but by reading this book, I found out a new thing about Joseph, which we're going to talk about just in a little bit. But through this whole process, which he keeps reinforcing in this book, is that it's stage by stage, and those things that look terrible to us in the short term are really a grand, great picture in the long term. That's why he doesn't give all this thing out for us in advance. To really would be no way for us to understand it, really to comprehend how impossible God does when he puts all this stuff together for us. So there is the rest of the story, which, and again, from the little cartoon thing, we learn that he gets to the point where he's trusted, and he actually is in jail where you think he's going to be getting out. And one guy said he was going to help him get out, and then he doesn't. And yet that's one failure. And he was in jail for such a long period of time that he would feel that abandonment and to feel that impossibility, how God could use him, a prisoner, a guy rejected by his family, really to be any good, to have any plan. But yet I think in reading just Joseph and about him is told so much more about his character and how he stood with God throughout even this time. Doesn't show that he cursed him or didn't want to follow him.
Right.
It went from step to step.
Yeah. So, this is where the story takes a good turn. And Joseph couldn't have anticipated this, but as Tim was saying, one guy promised to get him out of jail, didn't. But through a weird set of circumstances, God gives Joseph the ability to interpret some dreams of a famous the Pharaoh, and also to just some dreams, some visions, and leadership wisdom that he had. And talking about, he said that there was going to be 7 years of abundance that was going to happen, and that came to fruition. And so he actually, this picture kind of shows how, compared to that to the earlier one where he dressed like a shepherd boy and then with the coat, but now he's royalty, and Pharaoh gives him tremendous responsibility and honor over tons of Egyptians and lots of influence. And what Joseph said comes to fruition, that there are 7 years of abundance, and they store up tons, and nations around there, like we saw earlier in the video, did not do that. And then sure enough, after those 7 years, he also prophesied that God told him there would be 7 years of famine, I believe, after that. And it rocked the region all around there, but they were the only ones that had prepared for that. And so not only were they able to take care of their people, but they were able to actually feed other nations that came in wanting to pay because their people were dying. And so in that point of the story, Joseph's family, all his brothers, end up coming to Egypt to actually, or to where Joseph was, begging for this food, not realizing they were going to bump into someone very familiar from their past. And this next scene is kind of the end of the story, where they come to him and they don't know who he is, and then this is kind of what happens.
So you are now ready to sacrifice your lives for one of your brothers?
Yes.
Why then did you not do the same for the other one? The one you said died when in truth you yourselves sold him into slavery.
You know about Joseph? How?
Because he's alive.
Alive?
He's here in this palace. In fact, he's in this room. Leave us. I said leave us, get out!
Guards, come!
I am Joseph.
Joseph. It is my brother Joseph.
Go ahead, Tim.
That is great how that puts it together because, and again, what I was referring to earlier about the real rest of the story, the real thing that I haven't heard about before until I read this chapter. I thought that when Joseph saw his brothers finally and they reunited, I thought it was strange at first that none of his brothers recognized him, but we got to remember that was 22 years that he was away from the time he was a child till this point in his life. And that he wasn't, well, part of it wasn't just crying because he was reunited with his brothers, but what he figured out at that time, why he was weeping, when he kept referring back to Genesis and the scripture we're going to look at here in a little bit, was that he realized that what God had done in his past life, all those trials he had done was for a greater good. All those things that he had to go through was a process of a bigger plan. All that pain that he had to go through brought him to this point. And he not only saved the lives of all his family because they had to come to him for grain because he interpreted Pharaoh's dream of 7 years of famine, 7 years of good. Well, it started with the good first and the plenty, which he stored up. But then when they started getting to the 7 years of famine, then his own family would have to come to him. And not only did he save his own family, but he was part of a larger God's plan in saving thousands and thousands and thousands of people from Egypt, from that famine. That if he wasn't there, if God didn't place him there to interpret that dream and to save really Egypt and the hundreds of thousands, who knows how many thousands of people, of the lives that God helped him save through this whole process. So he quotes this scripture, so then it was not you. This is Joseph. So then it was not you who sent me, but God. It was not his brothers that put him in the, really, essentially letting that thing, that bad thing in the pit, being put in prison, being tested, and then being, being feeling abandoned and the impossible thing that couldn't really happen. He said this 3 times. That it was not you, it was not anybody else, but it was God who made all this happen. And we are so fortunate now that we get to see the end story. We get to see it now, looking back through his whole life, and he does that. And what Morley says in his book is just really, really great. Nothing that happens to us by human decision can ever happen apart from the will of God. Let me read that again. And this is so many nuggets in this book that I really pray that you get this and you study this and look at this. It's not a hard read. They're not really long, but there's so much meat in it. Nothing that happens to us by human decision can ever happen apart from the will of God. And that's great.
It's really important that in describing God's will, and when he says it was not you who sent me here, but God, that that's something we have to be very careful when we talk to people that aren't Christians or in the midst of deep crisis or death in the family or just real trauma, that when we say it's the will of God, sometimes when we say cliche, well, it's God's will or that kind of thing, it can imply something that we don't mean to imply, that God actually gave someone cancer, or God actually caused a car wreck or that kind of thing. And I think Tim and I would agree that God gives good things. There are a few times in the Old Testament and some of the New where he actually caused and killed people or different things, but more often times than not, it's Satan that in the broken world that we live in, that God uses that he allows things to pass through his hand because he knows the ultimate good that he can do tremendous things with. And so even when it says it was not you who sent me here, but God, I don't think that Joseph was saying God threw me in the well or God did this, but no, because you threw me in the well and you made that decision and those kinds of things, God is the one that used that in a mighty way and brought me here and orchestrated situations to happen to where, like Tim said, that he didn't just save his life and restore his family, but he saved the life of thousands through the famine in that way. So to say something's God's will, it may not be that, you know, God willed bad things to happen, but it's God's will ultimately that it doesn't happen by surprise, that God's in control of all of it, and that Satan just doesn't get to run rampant and do whatever he wants, that God gets to make some of those calls. And that's some of the most difficult things that we have to go through and to understand is, do we really trust him even when we don't see physically what's happening?
And it doesn't matter our family, our life, you know, that this trust here, this is our next question. Do you trust the will of God? Do you really trust that? But even in our own dysfunctional families that we have, or that Joseph's family was totally dysfunctional. Favoritism from Jacob, and the hate that he had from his brothers, and the even Joseph saying that he can interpret dreams. So this is such a great lesson to us that God can have all things done to his glory. And that, you know, if we really believe that, if we really believe this is the next principle where Morley talks about, this is principle number 2 for Joseph, the principle of the greater good, how God shapes men for a higher purpose. God makes men by orchestrating even the toughest circumstances of our lives for the greater good. Todd, are we going to just mention the 4 areas? We mentioned that in our questions, though, don't we? About marriage and work.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. But this is number 2. So every week there's going to be a principle, and they build again on one top of each other.
Awesome. All right. I'm going to stop the share at this point, and we'll move into small group. Everybody still awake? All right.
Nope, Tom Funk's blank.
Did your did Tom Funk's cell phone go out? Because he's
Here.
You're still there? Okay.
I'm here.
Okay, I got a black screen, so I just wondered. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to unmute all of you guys. Let me stop the recording first.